Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Last Patrol. Master Sergeant Brandon Hahn crouched behind the concrete barrier, his rifle trained on the compound's main entrance as sweat dripped down his face in the Afghanistan heat. 6 months into his third deployment, Brandon had learned to trust his instincts, and right now, those instincts were screaming that something was wrong with this mission. Alpha Team, report. His radio crackled with Lieutenant Travis Coyle's voice. All quiet on the north side, Brandon responded, his eyes never leaving the target building. But this feels like a setup, LT. At 32, Brandon had seen enough combat to know when intelligence was bad, when local informants were lying, when a routine patrol was about to become a nightmare. The compound they'd been sent to clear was supposedly an abandoned Taliban weapons cache, but the structure looked too clean, too obviously empty. Brandon's mind drifted, as it often did during the long waits between action, to his family back in Fort Carson, Colorado. Shannon, his wife of 7 years, and Emma, their 5-year-old daughter who had his dark hair and serious eyes. Emma was the reason Brandon kept taking these deployments. The extra pay meant she could go to private school, meant Shannon could stay home instead of working, meant his little girl would have opportunities he'd never had growing up poor in rural Montana. The explosion that rocked the compound's eastern wall brought Brandon back to the present with violent clarity. The mission had just gone sideways. Contact East. IED detonation. Coyle's voice was tight with adrenaline. Bravo team, move to support. Brandon sprinted toward the sound of gunfire, his combat training taking over. As he rounded the corner, he saw what had happened. Their Afghan interpreter had triggered a hidden explosive, but instead of the devastating blast that should have killed everyone within 50 meters, the device had been a dud. Mostly, the interpreter, a young man named Fahim who had 2 daughters back in Kabul, was conscious but bleeding from shrapnel wounds to his legs. Brandon immediately moved to provide medical aid, applying pressure bandages with the efficiency born of too much practice. Why? Brandon asked quietly as he worked. Why lead us into this? Fahim's eyes were filled with tears, not from pain, but from shame. They have my family, Sergeant. Said they would kill my daughters if I didn't bring you here. Brandon understood immediately. The enemy had played on Fahim's love for his children to turn him into bait. It was a tactic Brandon had seen before, one that exploited the most fundamental human weakness, the need to protect family. As he called in the medical evacuation for Fahim, Brandon made a mental note to call home that evening. Emma would be getting ready for bed, and he wanted to hear her voice, to remind himself why these deployments mattered. He had no way of knowing that this would be the last normal conversation he'd have with his daughter for a very long time. The mission debrief took 3 hours, followed by paperwork that stretched well into the night. By the time Brandon was able to make his scheduled call home, it was past midnight in Afghanistan, early evening in Colorado. The phone rang 4 times before Shannon answered, her voice distracted and slightly irritated. Brandon, I wasn't expecting you to call tonight. Miss me too, sweetheart, Brandon said, injecting humor into his voice despite his exhaustion. Rough day here. Wanted to hear friendly voices. Is Emma around? A pause. She's already asleep. Had a busy day. Something in Shannon's tone made Brandon's combat-honed instincts prickle. After 7 years of marriage, he knew his wife's tells. The slight hesitation when she was hiding something. The way her voice got higher when she was nervous. Everything okay at home? He asked carefully. Everything's fine, Brandon. You worry too much. Shannon's voice became brisk, businesslike. How much longer on this deployment? For more months, probably. What? Another pause, longer this time. No reason. Just missing you, that's all. But Brandon had heard something in the background during that pause. A man's voice, low and distant, saying something he couldn't make out. When he tried to focus on it, the sound had stopped. Shannon, was someone there with you? What? No, of course not. It was probably the TV. Her voice had definitely gone higher now. Brandon, I should go. Early morning tomorrow. The call ended with the usual, I love you exchange, but Brandon stared at the phone long after the line went dead. In 6 months of deployment calls, Shannon had never cut a conversation short. She'd never seemed distracted when he called. And she'd never failed to put Emma on the phone. Brandon's team leader, Sergeant First Class Johnny McIntosh, found him sitting outside the communication tent at 0200 hours, staring at his phone. Problem at home, Han? McIntosh was a career soldier, 20 years in the Army, with the kind of weathered face that had seen everything the military could throw at a man. Maybe, Brandon said quietly. Something felt off about my call tonight. McIntosh sat down beside him on the wooden bench. Want to talk about it? Brandon considered the question. McIntosh was from Texas, had been through 2 ugly divorces, and had the kind of practical wisdom that came from making every mistake at least once. My wife seemed nervous, distracted, and I think I heard another man's voice in the background. McIntosh was quiet for a long moment. How long you been deployed? 6 months. Long time for a woman to be alone with a kid. Brandon felt anger flash through him. Shannon's not like that. She knew what she was signing up for when she married a soldier. Maybe, McIntosh said diplomatically. But people change, Han. Especially when they're scared and lonely and dealing with stress. As Brandon lay in his bunk that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the distant sound of artillery, he found himself thinking about Fine. How easily the enemy had turned him by threatening his family. How love for his daughters had made him vulnerable to manipulation. Brandon had always thought his family was his strength. For the first time, he wondered if they might also be his weakness. He had no idea how right he was, or how much more complicated the truth would prove to be. Chapter 2. The Call. The mortar attack came at dawn, 3 days after Brandon's troubling phone call home. As he huddled in the bunker with his squad, listening to the incoming shells whistle overhead, Brandon's satellite phone rang with an incoming call from a Colorado number he didn't recognize. Han, he answered, shouting over the sound of explosions. Master Sergeant Brandon Han? The voice was professional, clinical. This is Dr. Patricia Soto at Children's Hospital, Colorado. Sir, we have your daughter Emma here in our emergency room. Brandon's world tilted. The mortar attack, the danger, everything else faded to background noise as he pressed the phone tighter to his ear. What happened? Is she hurt? Sir, your wife brought Emma in about an hour ago. The child appears to have been locked in a vehicle for an extended period. She's severely dehydrated and suffering from heat exposure, but she's conscious and responsive. Locked in a vehicle? Brandon's voice was barely controlled. For how long? Dr. Soto's hesitation told him everything he needed to know before she spoke. Based on her condition and what we've been able to piece together, possibly 3 days. The words hit Brandon like a physical blow. 3 days. His 5-year-old daughter had been trapped in a car for 3 days while he was half a world away, unable to protect her. Where is my wife? The question came out as a growl. She's here at the hospital, sir. Would you like me to? Brandon heard Shannon's voice in the background, loud enough to carry over the phone connection, and what she said made his blood freeze in his veins. How the hell did she survive that? Tell his coward soldier father to pay the bills. The casual cruelty in his wife's voice, the complete lack of concern for Emma's suffering, the contempt she showed for his military service. It was like hearing a stranger speak with Shannon's voice. Sir, Dr. Soto's voice brought him back to the conversation. Are you still there? I'm here. Brandon's voice was steady now, controlled in the way that made his soldiers nervous. Doctor, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I'm taking emergency leave and will be on the first flight home. Until I arrive, Emma is not to be left alone with my wife. Do you understand? Sir, I'm not sure I have the authority. Doctor. Brandon's tone carried the kind of command authority that had kept soldiers alive in combat zones. My daughter was locked in a car for 3 days. Whatever happened wasn't an accident. Treat this as a potential child abuse case and follow your protocols accordingly. A long pause. Then Dr. Soto's voice became more professional, more alert. I understand, Sergeant Han. We'll take appropriate precautions. And doctor, I need you to document everything. Every injury, every statement, every interaction with my wife. I'll want copies of all medical records when I arrive. Of course, sir. The line went dead, and Brandon stared at the phone for a long moment as mortar shells continued to fall around the base. His squad was looking at him with concern. They'd heard enough of the conversation to understand that something was catastrophically wrong at home. McIntosh, Brandon called to his team leader. I need to see the company commander. Now. Captain Terrence Adams was a competent officer who understood that soldiers with family emergencies were liabilities in combat situations. When Brandon explained the situation, carefully editing out his suspicions about Shannon's involvement, Adams immediately approved emergency leave. Take all the time you need, Han, Adams said. Family comes first. As Brandon packed his gear, his mind was already working with the same methodical precision he brought to mission planning. Emma's survival after 3 days in a locked car was remarkable. 5-year-olds weren't supposed to have that kind of resilience, which meant either she'd gotten incredibly lucky or someone had taught her survival techniques. Brandon remembered the games he'd played with Emma before his deployment, hide-and-seek exercises where she had to find water sources, stay quiet for extended periods, regulate her body temperature. He disguised them as fun activities, but they were really basic survival training adapted for a child. Emma had survived because she'd remembered his lessons. But that raised even more disturbing questions. If Shannon had locked Emma in the car deliberately, why? What could possibly motivate a mother to torture her own child? And what did the phrase, "coward soldier father," mean? Shannon had always been proud of his military service, had bragged to her friends about being married to a decorated combat veteran. Unless she wasn't the Shannon he thought he'd married. The flight from Kandahar to Denver took 18 hours with connections, giving Brandon plenty of time to think, to plan, and to prepare himself for what he might find when he got home. He'd left Afghanistan as a husband and father dealing with a family emergency. He was returning as a soldier whose primary mission had just become protecting his daughter from the woman who was supposed to love her most. By the time the plane touched down at Denver International Airport, Brandon Hahn had transformed from a concerned parent into something much more dangerous. A combat veteran with advanced military training who'd just discovered that the enemy had been living in his own home. Shannon and whoever was helping her had made one critical error in their planning. They'd hurt his daughter. Now they were going to learn what happened when you declared war on a man who'd spent his adult life becoming very, very good at winning wars. The taxi ride to Children's Hospital gave Brandon time to make several important phone calls. The first was to his bank, where he discovered that Shannon had withdrawn nearly $15,000 from their joint account over the past month, money that was supposed to be Emma's college fund. The second call was to their family lawyer, who informed Brandon that Shannon had been asking questions about military benefits, life insurance policies, and what would happen to their assets if Brandon were killed in action. The third call was to Johnny McIntosh, who was still in Afghanistan but had access to resources that weren't available to civilians. "Mac," Brandon said when the call connected, "I need a favor. A big one. Name it, brother. I need a complete background check on my wife. Employment history, financial records, social media, phone records, everything you can legally access. And I need it yesterday." McIntosh was quiet for a moment. "Hon, what exactly are you walking into over there?" Brandon looked out the taxi window at the Denver skyline, thinking about his daughter lying in a hospital bed after 3 days of torture. "I honestly don't know, Mac. But I'm going to find out." "Copy that. Give me 6 hours." As the taxi pulled up to the hospital's emergency entrance, Brandon caught his reflection in the window. The man looking back at him had the same face he'd worn in combat zones, the same cold calculation in his eyes that had kept him alive through 3 deployments. Shannon had no idea that she'd just awakened something that should have stayed dormant. But she was about to learn. Chapter 3. The Hospital. Children's Hospital Colorado at night was a maze of sterile corridors and hushed conversations, but Brandon navigated it with military precision. Dr. Patricia Soto met him at the Pediatric Emergency Department in trance, a small, tired-looking woman with kind eyes and the bearing of someone who'd seen too much human cruelty. "Sergeant Hahn, I'm Dr. Soto. We spoke on the phone." Brandon shook her hand, noting the way she studied his face, probably looking for signs of the kind of man who might hurt a child. "How is Emma?" "Stable. Recovering. She's a remarkably resilient little girl." Dr. Soto gestured for Brandon to follow her down the hallway. "Sergeant, before you see her, there are some things we need to discuss." They stopped at a small consultation room where Dr. Soto opened a thick medical file. Emma was brought in suffering from severe dehydration, mild heat stroke, and what appears to be prolonged stress responses. Based on her condition and the limited information we've been able to gather, she was confined in a vehicle with minimal ventilation for approximately 72 hours. Brandon felt his hands clench involuntarily. "What did my wife tell you about how this happened?" Dr. Soto's expression became carefully neutral. "Mrs. Hahn's account has been inconsistent. Initially, she claimed Emma had wandered off and gotten trapped in an abandoned car. When pressed for details, she changed her story to say Emma had locked herself in their vehicle while playing. And you believe that? No. Dr. Soto's voice was firm. 5-year-olds don't typically survive 3 days in a locked car by accident. Emma showed signs of having rationed water, regulated her body temperature, and maintained mental focus throughout the ordeal. Someone taught her survival techniques. Brandon felt a mixture of pride and horror. Pride that his daughter had remembered his lessons, horror that she needed to use them. She's smart. Always has been. Sergeant, there's something else. Dr. Soto pulled out several photographs. Emma had these with her when she was found. The photos showed Emma at various ages, but in each one, she was with Brandon, never with Shannon. Birthday parties, Christmas mornings, bedtime stories. Every precious moment had been documented, but Shannon was conspicuously absent from all of them. Where did she get these? According to Emma, she keeps them hidden in her backpack. She says. Dr. Soto hesitated. She says they help her remember that her daddy will always come home. Brandon's throat tightened. Emma had been preparing for abandonment, holding on to proof that at least one parent loved her. Where's my wife now? She left about an hour ago. Said she had to take care of some business and would be back in the morning. Brandon checked his watch, 10:47 p.m. What kind of business required Shannon's attention at nearly 11 o'clock at night, while her daughter lay in a hospital bed? Doctor, I need to see Emma now. Then I need copies of all medical records, photos of her injuries, and a written report of everything my wife said while she was here. Dr. Soto nodded. Child Protective Services will want to interview both you and Emma tomorrow. I've already filed the mandatory report. Brandon followed Dr. Soto to the pediatric ward, where Emma lay sleeping in a bed that seemed far too large for her small frame. Lines ran to her arm, providing the fluids her tiny body desperately needed. But what broke Brandon's heart was the way she was sleeping, curled into a defensive position, one arm wrapped protectively around a small stuffed animal he'd given her before his deployment. Emma. Brandon spoke softly as he approached the bed. His daughter's eyes opened immediately, and when she saw him, her face lit up with a smile that made Brandon's chest ache. Daddy, you came home. Brandon carefully gathered Emma into his arms, mindful of the 4 lines. She felt too light, too fragile, but she was alive and alert and calling him Daddy. I'm here, sweetheart. Daddy's here now. Emma pulled back to look at his face, her dark eyes serious beyond her years. I used the tricks you taught me, Daddy. I stayed calm and found water and didn't panic. You did perfect, baby girl. I'm so proud of you. Mommy said you were never coming back. She said soldiers like you always die and leave their families. Emma's voice was matter of fact, but Brandon could hear the underlying hurt. Brandon's jaw clenched, but he kept his voice gentle. Mommy was wrong, Emma. Daddy always comes home to you. Always. Emma nodded as if this confirmed something she'd already known. I told the doctors that. I said my daddy would come get me. As Brandon held his daughter, listening to her breathe, his phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Stay away from our family, or you'll regret it. Brandon showed the message to Dr. Soto, who immediately called hospital security. But Brandon was already thinking beyond immediate safety measures. Someone wanted him to stay away from his own daughter. Someone was threatening him for trying to protect Emma, which meant this wasn't just about Shannon having an affair or even about child neglect. This was about something bigger, something that required Emma to be completely separated from her father. Brandon's military training had taught him to identify patterns, to see connections that others missed. The mysterious withdrawals from their bank account, Shannon's questions about his life insurance, the calculated cruelty toward Emma, and now threats to keep him away. It all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. Someone was planning for Brandon to die, and they needed Emma isolated and vulnerable when it happened. As Emma drifted back to sleep in his arms, Brandon made calls to 2 people. The first was to a private investigator who specialized in military families. The second was to his commanding officer, requesting an extension of his emergency leave for family reasons. When dawn broke over Denver, Brandon would begin hunting the people who'd tortured his daughter. But unlike the enemies he'd faced in Afghanistan, these predators had made the mistake of targeting the one person in the world he'd died to protect. They'd wanted a war. Now they had one. Chapter 4, The Investigation. Brandon spent the night in Emma's hospital room, alternating between watching his daughter sleep and making discreet phone calls. By morning, he'd assembled a picture of the past 6 months that made his blood run cold. The private investigator, a former military police officer named Cecilia Townsend, had worked through the night to provide Brandon with information that painted Shannon as a stranger wearing his wife's face. Bank records showed not just the $15,000 in withdrawals Brandon already knew about, but a pattern of financial activity that suggested careful planning over months. "Your wife has been converting assets to cash systematically," Cecilia explained over the phone. "Jewelry sold, bonds cashed out, even your daughter's savings account emptied. But here's what's interesting. She's not spending the money on typical affair expenses. No hotel charges, no fancy restaurants, no unexplained shopping sprees." Brandon was sitting in the hospital's family consultation room while Emma slept. Then what's she doing with it? Best guess? Building a disappearing fund. The kind of money someone needs to start over with a new identity in a new place. Which confirmed Brandon's growing suspicion that Shannon's plan required him to be permanently removed from the picture. What about her background? Any red flags there? Cecilia's hesitation was telling. "Brandon, how much do you really know about Shannon's life before you met her?" "We met at a military appreciation event in Colorado Springs 7 years ago. She was working as a nurse, had moved there from Oregon to be closer to family. Except she's never worked as a nurse in Colorado. The credentials she claimed to have, they don't exist. And there's no record of her having family in the state." Brandon felt the ground shifting beneath him. "That's impossible. I've seen her nursing certificates, her college transcripts. Excellent forgeries, probably." "Brandon, the woman you married appears to have created an entirely fictional background. The scary part is how thorough it was. She had references, employment history, even a plausible explanation for why she wanted to move to Colorado." Brandon stared out the window at the Denver morning, thinking about his wife's behavior patterns with new eyes. Shannon had always been vague about her past, had claimed her parents were dead, and she had no siblings to speak of. She discouraged him from digging too deeply into her history, saying it was too painful to discuss. He'd thought he was being considerate of her grief. In reality, he'd been enabling an elaborate deception. "There's more," Cecilia continued. "I ran the phone number that sent you the threatening text last night. It's registered to a man named Kent Cardenas, but when I cross-referenced that with local databases, I found something interesting." "What?" "Kent Cardenas has been arrested twice in the past 5 years on charges related to military benefit fraud. Both times, the charges were dropped due to lack of evidence, but the pattern suggests he specializes in targeting military families." Brandon's grip tightened on the phone. Targeting them how? Insurance fraud, identity theft, benefit scams, anything that exploits the unique vulnerabilities of military personnel. Deployed soldiers are particularly attractive targets because they're physically absent and emotionally isolated. The pieces were finally forming a picture that made sense. Shannon hadn't just been having an affair while Brandon was deployed, she'd been part of a criminal operation designed to exploit military families. Emma's kidnapping and torture weren't random cruelty. They were part of a deliberate plan to isolate Brandon, make him desperate, and eventually eliminate him entirely. Brandon's phone buzzed with a call from Johnny McIntosh in Afghanistan. "Han, you sitting down? Because what I found is going to ruin your day." "My day's already ruined, Mac." "Hit me." "Your wife's been in contact with someone at our forward operating base. Someone's been feeding her information about patrol schedules, mission timelines, even casualty reports before they're officially released." Brandon felt ice form in his stomach. Someone on the inside? Has to be. The information she's been getting is classified, real-time intelligence. And get this, the contact appears to have started about 2 weeks before that IED incident with Fahim. The incident where Brandon had nearly been killed. The mission that had felt like a setup from the beginning. "Mac, are you saying someone tried to have me killed in Afghanistan?" "I'm saying someone's been providing information that would make it easy to predict where you'd be and when. Draw your own conclusions." Brandon ended the call and sat in stunned silence. The scope of the conspiracy was far beyond anything he'd imagined. This wasn't just about Shannon and Kent Cardenas. There was someone in his own unit, someone with access to classified information who was actively working to get him killed. Which meant Emma's torture had been both revenge for his survival and a message: stop investigating or your daughter pays the price. Dr. Soto appeared in the doorway of the consultation room. "Sergeant Han, Emma's awake and asking for you. And there's something else. Your wife is here." Brandon stood up, feeling the familiar calm that came over him before combat. Where is she? Waiting area near the elevator. She seems agitated. Brandon made his way through the hospital corridors with purposeful strides. When he rounded the corner, he saw Shannon pacing near the elevators, her cell phone pressed to her ear. She was speaking in hushed, urgent tones, and her body language screamed stress and fear. "Told you this would happen if we moved too fast," she was saying. "Now he's here, and he's asking questions." Shannon noticed Brandon approaching and immediately ended the call, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Brandon, thank God you're here. I've been so worried about Emma." Brandon studied the woman he'd thought he'd married, noting details he'd never paid attention to before. The way she held herself was different, more calculating, less open. Her smile was practiced, artificial. Even her voice seemed slightly wrong, as if she was performing the role of caring wife rather than actually being one. "Shannon." Brandon's voice was carefully neutral. "We need to talk." "Of course. I know you must have questions about what happened." "It was so scary, Brandon. Emma just wandered off and—" "Stop." Brandon's command was quiet but carried absolute authority. "Just stop lying to me." Shannon's mask slipped for just a moment, and Brandon saw something cold and calculating in her eyes before the fake concern returned. "Brandon, I don't know what you mean. I would never lie about something like this." 3 days, Brandon said, stepping closer. "Emma was locked in a car for 3 days. She nearly died. And when the doctor called to tell me what happened, I heard you in the background saying, 'How the hell did she survive that?'" Shannon's face went white. You misunderstood what?" "I understood perfectly." Brandon's voice was deadly quiet now. "The question is, who are you really? Because you're sure as hell not the woman I married." For a long moment, Shannon stared at Brandon as if weighing her options. Then her expression hardened into something he'd never seen before. Pure, undisguised hatred. "You want the truth, Brandon? The truth is that you're a convenient fool who fell for exactly the kind of sob story that works on lonely soldiers. The truth is that Emma was supposed to die in that car, and when this is all over, so are you." The confession was delivered with such casual venom that Brandon almost didn't process it immediately. When he did, his combat training took over, and he found himself studying Shannon with the same analytical detachment he'd used to evaluate an enemy combatant. "Who are you working with?" Shannon's smile was razor-sharp. "People who are very good at making soldiers disappear. People who've been planning this for a very long time." "And Emma? What was the point of torturing my daughter?" "Practice," Shannon said simply. "To see how long it would take you to break, how desperate you'd become. We needed to know your psychological profile before we moved to the final phase." Brandon felt something inside him that he'd kept carefully controlled during years of military service finally snap. The woman standing in front of him had tortured his 5-year-old daughter as a psychological experiment. She'd married him, lived in his house, pretended to love him for 7 years, all while planning his murder. But Brandon was a professional soldier, trained to channel rage into strategic action. Shannon and her associates had made one critical error in their planning. They'd thought they were dealing with a victim. Instead, they'd just declared war on a man who'd spent his adult life becoming very, very good at killing enemies and protecting the innocent. "Shannon," Brandon said quietly, "you just made the biggest mistake of your life." "What's that?" Brandon's smile was colder than anything Shannon had ever seen. "You let me find out while I'm still alive." Chapter 5, The Network. Brandon's first call after Shannon's confession was to Denver Police Detective Paige Lamb, who specialized in crimes against military families. His second call was to the FBI field office in Denver, where Agent Violet Burke had been tracking Kent Cardenas for over a year as part of a larger investigation into military benefit fraud. But it was his third call that would prove most important. To Colonel Travis Coyle, his former lieutenant who'd been promoted and was now stationed at the Pentagon with oversight responsibilities for military criminal investigations. "Han," Coyle said when the call connected. "Heard you were on emergency leave. Everything okay?" "No, sir, it's not." Brandon quickly outlined the situation, from Emma's torture to Shannon's confession to the evidence of inside information being leaked from Afghanistan. Coyle was quiet for a long moment. "Brandon, what you're describing sounds like a sophisticated operation targeting multiple military families. If there's someone in your unit providing classified information." "Sir, I need help. Official help." This is bigger than anything local law enforcement can handle. Agreed. I'm sending Agent Burke your contact information. She'll coordinate with local agencies, but this is now a federal investigation. While Brandon waited for the FBI to arrive, he returned to Emma's room to find his daughter awake and alert, coloring in a book that one of the nurses had brought her. The sight of her small hands gripping crayons with fierce concentration reminded Brandon why he was fighting. "Daddy," Emma said without looking up from her coloring, "Mommy came to see me." Brandon felt his blood pressure spike. While you were gone. She said she was sorry I got hurt, but that it was my fault for not listening." Brandon knelt beside Emma's bed, keeping his voice calm. "Sweetheart, what Mommy said isn't true. What happened to you was never your fault, and it's never okay for someone to hurt a little girl." Emma looked up at him with eyes that seemed far too old for a 5-year-old. "I know, Daddy. I know Mommy isn't good like you." The simple statement broke Brandon's heart. His daughter had figured out that her mother was dangerous before he had. Agent Violet Burke arrived an hour later, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd spent years investigating complex criminal conspiracies. She listened to Brandon's account without interruption, taking notes in a small leather notebook. "Mr. Hahn," she said when he finished, "Kent Cardenas is part of what we believe is a network specializing in what we call military family exploitation. They identify deployed soldiers with valuable assets, property, life insurance, military benefits, and systematically destroy their families while positioning themselves to inherit everything." "How many families are we talking about?" "We've identified at least 12 cases over the past 3 years. In each case, the soldier either died under suspicious circumstances while deployed or returned home to find their families destroyed and their assets stripped." Brandon felt sick. "And you think Shannon is part of this network?" "Based on what you've told me, she fits the profile perfectly. We believe these women are recruited specifically for their ability to maintain long-term deceptions. They're trained to create false identities, infiltrate military communities, and manipulate their targets over extended periods." Agent Burke pulled out a tablet and showed Brandon several photographs. "Do any of these men look familiar?" Brandon studied the faces, mostly military-age men in uniform. One photo made him stop cold. "That's Sergeant Perry Dalton. He was killed by an IED in Afghanistan 2 months ago." Sergeant Dalton's wife disappeared 3 days after his death, taking their 2 children and approximately $200,000 in life insurance money. "We believe she was part of the same network as your wife." The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Brandon was looking at what appeared to be a systematic operation to murder deployed soldiers and rob their families. "Agent Burke, there's something else. Someone in my unit has been providing classified information to Shannon. Information that could have gotten me killed." Burke's expression became grimmer. "That suggests the network has military personnel working as inside sources. Do you have any suspects?" Brandon thought about his deployment, about the people who'd had access to mission information, about who'd known his patrol schedules and communication windows with home. "There are maybe 6 people in my unit with access to the kind of information Shannon was getting. I can give you names, but—" Brandon hesitated. But some of these men have been my friends for years. I've trusted them with my life." Agent Burke nodded sympathetically. "Military benefit fraud cases are particularly devastating because they exploit the bonds of trust that military personnel depend on for survival. But Mr. Hahn, someone in your unit tried to have you killed. We need to identify them before they target another family." As if summoned by their conversation, Brandon's phone rang with a call from Afghanistan. The caller ID showed Johnny McIntosh. "Hahn, we've got a problem. Remember that background check you asked me to run on your wife?" "Yeah. Someone's been asking questions about my inquiries. Someone with enough authority to access my search history and track what databases I've been using." Brandon felt cold dread settling in his stomach. "Mac, get somewhere secure and call me back on a landline. Don't use your military communication equipment." The call ended, and Brandon looked at Agent Burke. "They know we're investigating. Someone with high-level access is monitoring communications from Afghanistan." Agent Burke was already reaching for her phone. "I'm calling the Pentagon. If there's a compromised communications network, we need to shut it down before more soldiers are put at risk." But as she placed the call, Brandon's mind was working on a more immediate problem. Shannon knew he was investigating. The network knew their operation had been exposed, which meant they would either run or escalate. Given that they'd already tortured a 5-year-old child, Brandon didn't think they were the type to run, which meant they were about to escalate, probably violently. Emma was safe in the hospital for now, but Brandon knew that safety was temporary. The network had demonstrated they were willing to hurt children to achieve their goals. They had inside information from military sources, and they had years of experience making problems disappear. Brandon looked at his sleeping daughter and made a decision that would define everything that came next. He wasn't going to wait for the network to make their next move. He was going to hunt them down first. Agent Burke finished her call and turned back to Brandon. Pentagon's mobilizing a task force to investigate the communications breach. But Mr. Hahn, I need you to understand something important. What's that? Based on the pattern we've seen with other cases, the network typically moves to eliminate witnesses within 72 hours of exposure. You and Emma are now primary targets. Brandon's expression didn't change, but something cold and dangerous settled in his eyes. Agent Burke, I need you to understand something too. Yes, these people made a mistake when they chose to target my family. I'm not some random deployed soldier they can manipulate and eliminate. I'm a combat veteran with advanced military training, 3 tours in Afghanistan, and absolutely nothing left to lose except my daughter. Brandon stood up, his demeanor shifting into something that Agent Burke recognized as distinctly military, controlled, professional, and utterly lethal. They wanted a war with the wrong soldier, Brandon said quietly. Now they're going to get one. Chapter 6, The Return. Brandon's house in Colorado Springs sat on 2 acres of wooded land, chosen specifically for its isolation and defensive advantages. As his taxi pulled into the driveway at dusk, Brandon noted immediately that someone had been inside. Window blinds positioned differently, subtle signs of search patterns, the kind of details that would be invisible to civilians but obvious to someone with his training. They'd been looking for something, probably documents or evidence that might expose the network's operations. What they'd found instead was a house that had been systematically prepared by a professional soldier who understood operational security. Agent Burke had wanted Brandon to stay at a safe house, but he'd convinced her that returning home would draw the network out into the open. Emma was safe in the hospital under FBI protection, and Brandon needed to end this threat before it could follow them for the rest of their lives. As he approached the front door, Brandon's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Come alone to the warehouse on Industrial Boulevard at midnight or your daughter dies. Brandon almost smiled. The network still thought they were dealing with a desperate father who could be manipulated through threats to his child. They had no idea they'd just invited a combat veteran to choose the ground for a battle they couldn't win. Inside the house, Brandon found exactly what he'd expected. His personal documents had been searched, his computer accessed, and several items moved or missing entirely. But the searchers had missed the hidden compartment in his bedroom closet, where Brandon kept his real insurance policy, military-grade surveillance equipment, encrypted communications gear, body armor, and weapons that weren't exactly standard civilian issue. Brandon had learned during his deployments that sometimes the official channels weren't enough to protect the people you loved. Sometimes you needed resources that existed in the gray areas between legal and necessary. As he prepared for the midnight meeting, Brandon's phone rang with a call from Johnny McIntosh in Afghanistan. "Hahn, I'm calling from an unsecured line, but I had to reach you. I found our leak." "Who?" "Sergeant First Class Gordon Riley, communications specialist, access to all patrol schedules and mission reports. But here's the thing. Riley's wife died in a car accident 6 months ago, and his 2 kids were placed in foster care after he was deployed." Brandon felt pieces clicking into place. Someone's been threatening his children. That's my read. Riley's been sending encrypted messages to an outside contact, but based on the timing and content, it looks like he's being coerced rather than willingly cooperating. Which meant Gordon Riley was another victim of the network, not a willing collaborator. They'd been using his children as leverage to force him to provide intelligence that could get other soldiers killed. "Mac, can you get Riley somewhere safe where he can talk freely?" "Already done. He's in my quarters right now, and he's ready to tell everything he knows. But Hahn, he says the operation is much bigger than just military benefit fraud." "What do you mean?" According to Riley, the network has been using military families to traffic drugs, weapons, and people across international borders. Deployed soldiers make perfect, unwitting couriers because they're not typically searched as thoroughly at customs. The scope of the conspiracy was even worse than Brandon had imagined. The network wasn't just stealing from military families. They were using them as cover for international criminal operations. Mac, I need you to get Riley's testimony to Agent Violet Burke at the Denver FBI field office. Full details, names, operational procedures, everything. Copy that. Huh. McIntosh's voice carried the weight of their friendship. These people aren't just criminals. They're enemy combatants targeting American military personnel. You have the right to defend yourself accordingly. Brandon understood the message. McIntosh wasn't just giving him information. He was giving him unofficial authorization to treat the network as a military threat rather than a civilian law enforcement matter. As Brandon finished his preparations, he reflected on the irony of the situation. The network had spent months planning his death, studying his psychology, manipulating his family. They thought they understood him, but they'd made one fundamental error in their assessment. They'd assumed Brandon would fight like a desperate civilian trying to protect his family. Instead, they were about to face a professional soldier defending his home territory against enemy combatants who'd already declared war by torturing his child. At 11:45 p.m., Brandon arrived at Industrial Boulevard, driving a rental car he'd acquired with cash. The warehouse district was exactly the kind of location he would have chosen for an ambush. Isolated, multiple entry and exit points, plenty of cover for supporting positions. The specific warehouse the network had designated was the abandoned metal fabrication facility, dark except for a single light visible through dirty windows on the second floor. Brandon parked 4 blocks away and approached on foot, using night vision equipment to identify the opposition's positions. What he found confirmed his tactical assessment. The warehouse was a trap, but not a particularly sophisticated one. 2 vehicles parked in defensive positions, at least 4 armed individuals visible through thermal imaging, and electronic jammers designed to block cellular communications. The network had prepared for a desperate father walking into their kill zone. They weren't prepared for a combat veteran who'd spent years learning how to turn enemy ambushes into their own worst nightmare. Brandon circled the warehouse perimeter, identifying each hostile position and planning his approach with the methodical precision that had kept him alive through 3 deployments. When he was ready, he sent a single text message to Agent Burke. Warehouse compromised. Network moving to eliminate witnesses. Recommend federal response in 30 minutes. Then Brandon shut off his phone and became the kind of soldier the network should have investigated more carefully before they chose to make him their enemy. The war they'd started by torturing his daughter was about to end in a way they'd never anticipated. Chapter 7. The Warehouse. Brandon's assault on the warehouse began at exactly midnight, but not in the way the network expected. Instead of walking through the front entrance like a desperate father responding to threats, Brandon used his military training to turn their ambush into a methodical elimination of enemy combatants. The first hostile went down silently. A spotter positioned on the warehouse's roof, who never saw Brandon approaching from the building's blind spot. The second fell to a combat knife, his radio disabled before he could alert the others that their perimeter had been breached. By the time Brandon reached the warehouse's main floor, he'd reduced the opposition from 4 armed hostiles to 2. And neither of the survivors knew their backup was already dead. Kent Cardenas was waiting inside the warehouse with Shannon, both of them armed and positioned near a table where they'd spread out what appeared to be documents and photographs. When Brandon appeared in the doorway, moving with the controlled aggression of a professional soldier clearing a hostile building, their confident expressions transformed into something approaching panic. "You're supposed to be unarmed," Cardenas said, raising his weapon with the shaky grip of someone who'd never been in actual combat. "I'm supposed to be a lot of things," Brandon replied, his rifle trained on Cardenas with rock-steady precision. "Dead in Afghanistan. Broken by grief. Desperate enough to walk into your trap unarmed." Shannon stepped forward, trying to regain control of the situation. "Brandon, you need to listen to us. We have information about your daughter." "I know exactly where my daughter is," Brandon interrupted. "She's safe in a hospital under FBI protection while I deal with the people who tortured her." The documents on the table caught Brandon's attention. Photographs of military families, financial records, what appeared to be operational plans for targeting deployed soldiers. The scope of the network's activities was even more extensive than Agent Burke had indicated. How many families? Brandon asked, his weapon never wavering from Cardenas. How many what? How many military families have you destroyed? How many soldiers have you killed? Cardenas and Shannon exchanged glances, and Brandon could see them calculating whether they could still manipulate him or if their situation had become hopeless. 17 confirmed eliminations over the past 3 years, Shannon said finally, her voice carrying a note of pride that made Brandon's blood run cold. Total asset recovery of approximately $4 million. 17 soldiers dead. 17 families destroyed. $4 million stolen from the people who'd sworn to defend their country. The children, Brandon said quietly. What happened to the children in those families? Shannon's smile was pure malice. Some were adopted through private agencies we control. Others weren't lucky enough to survive their parents' tragic accidents. Brandon felt something inside him that he'd kept carefully controlled throughout his military career finally break free. These people hadn't just committed crimes. They'd been systematically murdering American military personnel and their children for profit. Where's your inside source? Brandon asked. The one who's been providing classified information from Afghanistan. Cardenas looked confused. What inside source? Brandon studied their faces with the analytical skills that had kept him alive in combat zones. They were lying about something, but not about this. Which meant, you don't have someone inside my unit, do you? Brandon said as understanding dawned. You're getting your information from somewhere else. Shannon's expression shifted, becoming wary. We have sources you'll never identify. People in positions you can't imagine. But Brandon was already putting the pieces together. The network's operations were too sophisticated, too well-coordinated to be run by criminals working alone. The level of intelligence they'd been receiving suggested official channels, not just corruption within individual military units. This is a government operation, Brandon said, the words coming out like a physical blow. You're not independent criminals. You're working for someone in the federal system. The silence that followed confirmed Brandon's worst fears. The network that had tortured his daughter and murdered 17 military families wasn't just a criminal organization. It was a government-sanctioned operation targeting American soldiers. Who's running it? Brandon demanded, his rifle now pointed directly at Shannon's center mass. Who gave you orders to target military families? Shannon's laugh was bitter, desperate. You really think we're going to tell you that? Brandon, you have no idea how deep this goes, how many people are involved, how much money is at stake. Then explain it to me. Military families represent billions of dollars in assets, benefits, and insurance policies, Cardenas said, apparently deciding that cooperation might extend his life. But most of that money is tied up in bureaucratic systems that are difficult to access unless you know the right people. Brandon felt sick as the implications became clear. Someone in the government is using you to steal military benefits. Someone in the government is using military benefits to fund operations that don't appear on any official budget, Shannon corrected. Black Ops programs, intelligence initiatives, activities that require deniable funding sources. The network hadn't been stealing from military families for personal profit. They'd been stealing from military families to fund unauthorized government operations. American soldiers were being murdered to provide untraceable funding for activities so classified that even Congress didn't know they existed. Brandon's phone buzzed with an incoming call from Agent Burke, but he didn't dare take his attention off the two armed hostiles in front of him. Whatever support was coming, it wouldn't arrive for several more minutes. Here's what's going to happen, Brandon said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd made life-and-death decisions in combat zones. You're going to give me names, locations, operational details, and proof of everything you've told me. Then you're going to surrender to federal authorities and testify against whoever's running this operation. Cardenas laughed. And if we refuse? Brandon's smile was colder than anything either of them had ever seen. Then I treat you the same way I'd treat any enemy combatant who'd tortured American children and murdered American soldiers. You can't just execute us, Shannon said, but her voice carried uncertainty. You're not in Afghanistan anymore. There are rules here. The rules changed when you tortured my 5-year-old daughter, Brandon replied. The rules changed when you murdered 17 American soldiers. The rules changed when you declared war on military families. Brandon's phone rang again, and this time he risked a glance at the caller ID. Agent Burke, which meant federal support was close. Last chance, Brandon said. Names and proof, or I start treating this as a combat situation. What happened next would determine not just whether Shannon and Cardenas survived the night, but whether the government operation they'd been working for would be exposed or buried along with its operatives. Brandon had spent his military career following orders and working within the system. But the system had just declared war on his family. Now the system was about to learn what happened when it chose the wrong soldier to target. Chapter 8. The Revelation. The sound of approaching vehicles made Cardenas desperate enough to try something stupid. He raised his weapon toward Brandon, but a combat veteran's reflexes are faster than a criminal's panic. Brandon's rifle spoke once, and Cardenas dropped his gun, clutching a shattered shoulder and screaming. Shannon froze, finally understanding that she was facing someone who'd been professionally trained to kill people more dangerous than her. Smart choice, Brandon said, stepping closer. Now start talking. Agent Burke's voice echoed from outside the warehouse. Federal agents. Building is surrounded. But Shannon wasn't looking at Brandon anymore. She was staring at something behind him, and her expression had shifted from fear to something approaching hope. Brandon spun around to find Agent Burke entering the warehouse with two other federal agents, all of them with weapons drawn. But something was wrong with the tactical formation they were using. Instead of securing the area and providing backup, they were positioning themselves to control all the exits. Agent Burke, Brandon said carefully, glad you could make it. Burke's expression was professionally neutral, but Brandon noted that her weapon wasn't pointed at Shannon or the wounded Cardenas. It was pointed at him. Sergeant Hahn, I need you to lower your weapon and step away from the suspects. Brandon felt pieces of a much larger puzzle clicking into place. Agent Burke, these suspects just confessed to murdering 17 military families as part of a government-funded operation. We need to secure their testimony before. Sergeant Hahn, Burke interrupted, lower your weapon. Now, the two agents with Burke had moved to flanking positions, and Brandon realized with growing horror that he wasn't being rescued. He was being contained. Shannon's smile was triumphant. Did you really think we were operating without official protection, Brandon? Did you think we could target military families for 3 years without someone in law enforcement covering for us? Brandon kept his rifle ready but didn't point it directly at any of the federal agents. Yet, Agent Burke, he said quietly, please tell me you're not part of this. Burke's expression showed genuine regret. Sergeant Hahn, you've stumbled into an operation that's classified at levels far above both of our pay grades. The people you think are criminals are actually intelligence assets working on behalf of national security. National security? Brandon's voice carried disbelief and rage. They tortured my 5-year-old daughter. Regrettable but necessary operational requirements. One of the other agents said dismissively. Military families occasionally become acceptable casualties in service of larger strategic objectives. Brandon stared at the man who'd just described his daughter's torture as an acceptable casualty and felt something snap inside him that had been holding back years of accumulated fury from watching good soldiers die for politicians' mistakes. Whose strategic objectives? Brandon asked, his voice deadly quiet. Agent Burke hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. Sergeant Hahn, the operation you've discovered provides funding for intelligence activities that Congress won't approve and the American public can't know about. Sometimes the security of the nation requires sacrifices from the people who've sworn to defend it. Sacrifices. Brandon repeated the word like it tasted bitter. You mean murdering soldiers and stealing from their families? I mean funding operations that keep America safe from threats you can't imagine, Burke replied. The money taken from military families funds intelligence networks that prevent terrorist attacks, eliminate foreign threats, and maintain strategic advantages that save thousands of lives. Brandon looked around the warehouse at the federal agents who were supposed to be protecting American citizens, but were instead enabling their murder. At Shannon, who'd spent 7 years pretending to love him while planning his death. At Cardenas, bleeding from his shoulder but still smiling because he knew the government would protect him. How many people are involved in this? Brandon asked. Enough, Burke said simply. Enough that your testimony would be discredited, your credibility destroyed, and your daughter placed in protective custody where she'd be much more vulnerable than she is now. The threat was clear and professionally delivered. cooperate, or lose Emma entirely. But Brandon had learned something about himself during his deployments that even Shannon's years of psychological manipulation hadn't uncovered. When pushed beyond his breaking point, when forced to choose between following orders and protecting the innocent, Brandon didn't break. He became something much more dangerous. "Agent Burke," Brandon said, his voice carrying the calm that preceded violence. "I want you to think very carefully about your next words. Because depending on what you say, I'm either going to surrender my weapon and trust the system to protect my daughter, or I'm going to decide that the system has become the enemy." Burke studied Brandon's face and apparently saw something there that made her reconsider her approach. "Sergeant Hahn, what would it take for you to walk away from this?" "Impossible things," Brandon replied. "Justice for the 17 families you've destroyed. Protection for Emma that doesn't depend on your goodwill. And accountability for everyone involved in this operation, regardless of how high up it goes." "You know I can't guarantee any of that." "Then we have a problem." The standoff stretched for several seconds, with federal agents pointing weapons at a decorated combat veteran who was pointing his weapon at criminals they were protecting. Everyone in the warehouse understood that what happened next would determine not just who lived or died, but whether a massive government conspiracy would be exposed or buried. Brandon's phone buzzed with an incoming text message. Without taking his eyes off Agent Burke, he glanced at the screen. The message was from Johnny McIntosh, package delivered. Riley's testimony with full documentation uploaded to WikiLeaks, major news outlets, and congressional oversight committees. Dead man's switch activated. If you don't check in every 6 hours, everything goes public. Brandon almost smiled. While he'd been dealing with the immediate threat, his friend had been ensuring that the network's crimes would be exposed regardless of what happened in this warehouse. "Agent Burke," Brandon said, his voice now carrying the confidence of a man who'd just won a war, "you should probably check your secure communications. I think you're about to receive some very urgent instructions from your superiors." Burke's expression shifted as she realized that Brandon had outmaneuvered the entire operation. Whatever happened to him now, the conspiracy would be exposed, and everyone involved would face consequences. Shannon's triumphant smile faded as she understood that her government protection had just evaporated. And Kent Cardenas stopped bleeding long enough to realize that he was about to become a very public example of what happened to people who tortured American children. The war was over. Brandon had won. Now came the reckoning. Chapter 9, Justice. The warehouse had become very quiet except for the sound of Agent Burke speaking urgently into her secure radio. Brandon could hear fragments of the conversation, words like compromised, exposure, and damage control. That confirmed what he already knew. Johnny McIntosh's dead man switch had just destroyed a multi-million-dollar covert operation with a single upload. When Burke finished her call, her expression had transformed from professional authority to something approaching defeat. "Sergeant Hahn, my superiors want to negotiate." "I'm not interested in negotiations," Brandon replied. "I'm interested in justice." Shannon, who'd been silent since realizing her government protection had evaporated, finally spoke up. "Brandon, you don't understand what you've done. The operations this funding supported were crucial to national security. People are going to die because..." Brandon's rifle swung toward her with lethal precision. 17 American soldiers are already dead because of your operation, along with an unknown number of their children. Don't talk to me about people dying." Agent Burke stepped forward carefully. "Sergeant Hahn, what do you want?" "I want everyone involved in this conspiracy arrested and prosecuted. I want the families of the murdered soldiers compensated. I want my daughter safe and the people who tortured her in prison for the rest of their lives." "The legal issues are complex." "The legal issues are simple," Brandon interrupted. "These people committed murder, kidnapping, torture, and fraud. The fact that someone in the government authorized it doesn't make it legal." Brandon's phone rang with a call from Colonel Travis Coyle at the Pentagon. "Hahn." Coyle's voice was tight with stress. "What the hell have you done?" "I've got generals screaming about operational security and senators demanding investigations." "Sir, I've exposed a criminal conspiracy that was murdering American soldiers and their families to fund unauthorized covert operations." "Hahn, those operations were..." "Were what, sir?" "Were worth murdering 17 decorated veterans. Were worth torturing my 5-year-old daughter. Were worth destroying families who'd already sacrificed everything for their country." Quo was quiet for a long moment. Han, I need you to know that not everyone in command structure was aware of what this operation entailed. When the reports come out tomorrow morning, there are going to be a lot of very angry people in very high places, which meant the conspiracy was about to face accountability from the very system it had been exploiting. Agent Burke's radio crackled with new instructions. After listening for several minutes, she turned back to Brandon with an expression that mixed respect with resignation. Sergeant Han, my superiors are ordering me to place Shannon Fox and Kent Cardenas under federal arrest on charges of murder, kidnapping, torture, and conspiracy. They'll be held without bail pending trial. Shannon's face went white. They can't just abandon us. We were following orders. Orders issued by people who are about to claim they never heard of you, Brandon said. Welcome to what happens when government assets become political liabilities. Cardenas, still bleeding from his shoulder wound, looked around the warehouse with the desperation of a man who'd just realized he was being thrown to the wolves. We have recordings, documentation, proof of who authorized this operation, which will make for very interesting testimony at your trial, Agent Burke said as she placed him under arrest. As federal agents secured the crime scene and arrested the conspirators, Brandon felt his phone buzz with a call from Children's Hospital Colorado. Sergeant Han, this is Dr. Soto. Emma's been asking for you. She's ready to go home. I'll be there in an hour, Doctor. Sergeant Han, the FBI agents protecting Emma told her that you made sure the people who hurt her can never hurt anyone else's children. She said to tell you that she's proud of her daddy. Brandon closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the past week finally beginning to lift. Emma was safe. The network was destroyed. The conspirators would face justice. But as he prepared to leave the warehouse, Agent Burke approached him one final time. Sergeant Han, I want you to know that not everyone in federal law enforcement was part of this conspiracy. Most of us became agents to protect people, not exploit them. Brandon studied her face, noting the genuine regret in her expression. Agent Burke, the people I respect most in this world are the ones who do their jobs even when it's difficult, even when they're pressured to look the other way. I hope you're one of those people. I am now, she said quietly. As Brandon drove back to the hospital to collect his daughter, he reflected on what the past week had taught him about family, loyalty, and the price of protecting the innocent. Emma would need time to heal from her trauma, and Brandon would need time to process the betrayal of the woman he'd thought he'd married. But they would heal together, as a real family built on genuine love rather than manipulation and lies. 6 months later, Shannon Fox and Kent Cardenas were convicted on multiple federal charges and sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. The government officials who'd authorized their operation faced congressional hearings, criminal investigations, and career-ending scandals. Gordon Riley was reunited with his children and received a full military pension along with compensation for his coerced participation in the conspiracy. The families of the 17 murdered soldiers received multi-million-dollar settlements and formal apologies from the Department of Defense. And Brandon Han returned to military service with a promotion and assignment to a Pentagon office responsible for investigating crimes against military families. Emma Han grew up understanding that the world could be dangerous and that people could be cruel, but that there would always be someone willing to fight for the innocent, someone who would never abandon the people who depended on him. Some battles were worth fighting regardless of the cost. Some children were worth saving regardless of the danger. Some families were worth protecting against any enemy, even when that enemy wore the uniform of the country they'd sworn to defend. Brandon Han had learned that family wasn't about blood or marriage certificates or legal documents. Family was about standing between the people you loved and anyone who wanted to hurt them. Everything else was just details.